It's nice to be here. Thanks to the Teaching American History folks for inviting me. My task today is to talk about civil rights and film. And I'm going to do that, but I'm going to try to do it at a couple of different levels. That is, I want to talk both about what it means to teach history with film, why we do that, and how it might be useful, and then to talk about some specific examples of using film to teach about civil rights. I'm going to focus today on the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, though of course civil rights could mean a much broader set of things, and arguably really should include things like Latino Americans' civil rights, gay and lesbian civil rights, earlier periods, immigration. I don't do that because I want to focus on a few thematics that we can carry through, but I do, on the list that I handed out, there are other types of films that you might use if you were thinking more broadly about civil rights. Now, I see that a lot of you are 8th grade teachers, which means you aren't actually teaching civil rights, and I know that, so I'm going to try to make a few gestures towards thinking about how this might actually be useful to you, and it's one of the reasons I want to talk at the beginning more theoretically about what it means to teach film and history. So there's a kind of graduate seminar section, and then there's a kind of let's all talk as teachers section about how to use these films. And what I'm hoping is that you will just interrupt me at any point, ask questions, clarifications, and then I'll try to also have discussions at each of the film clips that I show that we can talk about. So, you know, don't do what your students do to you. Instead, speak up and give me a hand, okay? All right. So what I want to do today is actually just make a few pretty simple arguments. So I want to talk today about, first, what do historians want? What is good history? Why might actually film help us do good history? If we're going to answer that question, we have to talk just a little bit about why I think good history isn't what we are always taught. Then that would mean going on to talk about using film and popular culture to teach history. I'm going to do that using an example, so don't worry, it's not as bad as you think, and I'll talk about how to do it, or how I like to do it, through several different examples. So I'm going to look at 3 or 4 different films today, depending on how time goes, and show you some examples of how I might suggest we teach those films as history, or in relation to talking about civil rights history. Now, to do this, I really want to talk about why I think we can use films in ways that are a little more expansive than sometimes people have done. That is, I remember once I was working with some high school teachers, and one of the guys, who is just a very well respected high school teacher, he's won a lot of awards, talked about using the film Glory in his class. Now, in the first place, I think that would actually be illegal for you all because it's an R-rated movie, but he uses it teaching Civil War history, and he said, I show the scene where the Denzel Washington character is punished by lashing on the back, and I always explain to them, this is just wrong, this was not a punishment used in the Union Army at this time, this is incorrect, and he sort of goes on and on about how the film is incorrect on this particular detail. And so I asked him, well, what do you think, why do you think they did that? I mean, do you think they didn't know, or are they trying to do something in that particular scene? And we had a long conversation about how a film might be accurate by being inaccurate, in the sense of showing something about the emotional degradations of slavery, referencing punishments of slaves, and speaking about that pain and suffering as part of what's going on in the movie. So that's one of the ways I want to talk about film today, not just that it's wrong a lot, which it is, but about the ways in which it might also be right. When I talk about what historians want, I mean this. When historians ask questions, the most important question we ask is why. Not, exactly when, though that's obviously really important, not who, that's crucial, all of these things, not how, all of these things matters, but fundamentally we ask the question, why did things happen? So, for example, we might ask, why did the civil rights movement emerge first and so vividly in the South, and how is that different than how it emerged in the North? Then you need a lot of information to answer that question, but the question is why? Or why did the civil rights movement happen in the 50s and 60s instead of in the 20s or the 70s or 80s? What role did women play, and why? All these questions that we ask have an urgency to them because we want to know why something happened. And I'll go even further than that and say I actually think it's useful to ask a question that our students probably ask a lot, which is, why does this matter? Why do I care? Why am I having to study this when I would so much rather be doing a lot of other things? And I think that actually there's some good reason to ask that question. Why does this matter? As a historian, I really believe that this matters a great deal, this history. But I think it matters in part, or in large part, because of how it relates to our lives today. So those kind of, sometimes when students ask them those kind of overly pragmatic questions about why should I care are actually good questions when they're reframed, which is you should care. It is connected to the things that we're thinking about today. And it's not a bad idea to make those connections for students, and I try to do it a good bit. So in order to ask that question, I'm now going to make a somewhat complicated argument, but one I think is really worth making. You won't be able to probably make it with your 8th graders or your 9th graders, but I think it's worth us talking about in terms of thinking about how to frame teaching. And that is kinds of history that I think are not useful and some kinds I think are. So I'm going to just mention a couple of ways of doing history that have their value, but I don't think have a great deal of value in terms of our teaching. One is antiquarianism, which is to say when folks focus on the details of the past, they're very interested in those details, and some folks do great work with that, but they don't ask the questions of why in the largest sense of it. So you might be, and I say this with no disrespect, but like you might be the person who works on the First Lady's gowns, which is my goddaughter's absolute favorite exhibit ever in the history of the Smithsonian or in life, and so we go and we go and we go. And these things are obviously fascinating to her. They're not uninteresting, but those gowns, they try sometimes to ask larger historical questions around the gowns, but it's not so easy. And it's, in that sense, more antiquarian. When you do the other thing, though, and you keep saying, well, why is this relevant? Why does it matter? What is this all about? You can be guilty of, at times, presentism. And presentism is asking why in too simplistic a way. We're not thinking about how people thought or lived in their own historical moments. So, for example, you ask questions that are relevant now but not quite appropriate to the time. So you might ask, for example, okay, since 19th century white abolitionists often represented African Americans as innocent and childlike, weren't they really racist? Now, questions about race are crucial, right? But you can't ask questions about were they racist or were they not racist without really understanding how race is working, what racial ideologies were in that particular period, what ways that might have been useful, what ways problematic. But to understand it very much in its own historical context is very different than asking the kind of questions we might ask now about somebody and just taking it right back. So you might ask another question. Were the women who were suffragettes in 1895 feminist? Well, you could ask a lot of questions about them, and what did they think about women, and what did they think about the rights of women, and what kind of language did they use for that? But you're bringing a category that we have now and maybe imposing it backwards, though some of them might have used similar language. They meant probably different things. So that presentism is a kind of ahistorical way of asking questions about the present of the past. But I want to suggest another way of asking questions about the past that draws heavily on the present, and that is, here we go, embrace the French, Michel Foucault's notion of genealogy. Now, how many of you studied Foucault in college? Did any of you? Okay, so yeah, so that's fine. You don't really need to study large parts of it, and we're not going to go into it in great detail. But I really like his notion of genealogy, which he calls a history of the present versus a history of the past. Now, what's the difference? Well, for him, you ask questions about what happened, how we got here, who we are, and then you look backwards to answer those questions. So Foucault did a lot of stuff with sexuality, and he's a person who made the argument that the categories of am I homosexual, am I heterosexual, emerged at a particular moment, that we want to know how we came to identify ourselves as gay or straight. We have to look back in the past and see how those categories emerged. So he asked very politically relevant questions, but he's very interested in how did we get to the moment where we ask those questions. So one of the great things about a genealogy is this. If you look at the kids, that's the present, right? We're the present, we're the kids, so to speak, asking questions about our family, asking questions about our past. Who are we? How did we get here? The further back you go, the more answers there are. So in other words, by the time you get to the great-grandparents, who am I? Where do I come from? How did I get here? Has many, many different answers, many different people whose past, whose history brought to bear on you. So in this sense, when you think about looking at the past genealogically, the further back you go, the more questions you have to ask and the more answers you have to search for to say, how did we get here? Now, what does that mean? Let's say, for example, we're looking at, as we will be today, civil rights. We want to ask questions about, the history of the civil rights movement. But we're really asking questions about the history of civil rights movement because we want to know something about the history of race. So in some ways, you could say it this way. A genealogical way to look at what we're going to do today is this. Why does it matter that Barack Obama might, we'll see, become president of the United States? Why does it matter that he, as an African-American man, would become president? Why does anybody care about that? Well, it might seem obvious, but you might then ask some very specific questions about the history of voting rights, about how it became possible for African-Americans to enter into public life as equals, about what the limits have been of that, the failures of the civil rights movement to really obtain, full equality for African Americans in all sorts of ways, and the struggle, the continuing struggle of since the civil rights movement. But you can also go back even further, and you could say, what happened after the Civil War that continued the legacies of race and racism that led to the need for the civil rights movement, that led to the moment in which Barack Obama might or might not become president, and the ways in which that matters to all sorts of different Americans. So all I'm suggesting is not a very complicated idea ultimately, but that we give ourselves permission in some ways to study history with present questions in mind. That we don't say it's wrong to ask about, to think about why these things matter directly to us today, but we ask those questions in a way that open up the difference of the past. We really ask the questions that say we need to look back and see how race happened, how ideas about race happened, how civil rights emerged, and to ask those questions of the past enthusiastically. So I'll give you some examples, and we can move forward and see if this makes sense to you. One of the reasons I'm talking about this is this. If you ask questions about the past this way, film becomes particularly helpful because of the things that it does well. It brings emotional power to the stories we try to tell. It often explicitly, more or less, says why this should matter to you, as we'll see from some examples today. It often sort of, and this is one of the problems of film and literature as well, but more often we're teaching film in these kinds of situations. It telescopes action. It gets certain things wrong, like the example I told you about the whipping in Glory. But it does that to almost provide like executive summaries of the political and moral message of the film, or the things that you're supposed to get out of studying this particular historical moment. And I also think that talking about film helps us, A, it helps us ask why do we care, but B, it helps us ask a lot of questions about sources, about types of interpretation. It opens up a lot of questions about what's true, what's not true, what's being told, what's not being told. It's very obvious in a way in some films, and you can bring it to other kinds of sources that you might be asking your students to use, be it first-person narratives or contemporary historians' accounts. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of this, and it's one of my favorites, but I'm going to start, it's actually kind of starting by cheating in this sense. I'm supposed to be talking about film, but I'm going to start with a song. And the reason is, I think this song is one of the greatest examples of a really sort of wonderful piece of popular culture that also gets almost everything it says wrong. So that's why I like it. So this is the Neville Brothers song from the late 80s called Sister Rosa.